The cardboard box in my arms held almost nothing: a coffee mug, a phone charger, a single folder. I walked out through the front entrance of Harrison Global's headquarters while laughter trailed behind me from the open office floor, sharp and hurried, the kind people allow themselves when they're certain they've already won. Vanessa Brooks stood near the glass doors, arms crossed, wearing the quiet smile of someone who had just solved a problem. I stepped onto the front stairs, reached into my pocket, and pulled out my phone. I made one call. My voice was level, almost casual. Fire every one of them. Within minutes, the building behind me began to collapse from the inside. My name is Lena Carter. I had been back in the United States for less than 3 weeks when I walked into Harrison Global's downtown headquarters carrying nothing but a leather messenger bag and a name that meant nothing to anyone in that building. That was exactly how I wanted it. I had spent the last several years working overseas, supply chain consulting, operational restructuring, the kind of unglamorous work that required long hours and short expectations. I had learned more from those years than from any boardroom meeting I had ever sat in, and when my father called to say the time had come, I didn't ask for the chairman's office. I asked for a desk on the 14th floor and a standard employee badge with no special access. My father, Harrison Carter, had built the company from a regional logistics firm into one of the largest privately held conglomerates in the country. Over 4 decades, he was 71 years old, deliberate in everything he did, and had spent the last 2 years preparing for a transition that most people inside the company didn't know was already in motion. Harrison had one condition: whoever took the seat after him had to understand the company from the ground up, not from above. I agreed without argument. It was the same philosophy that had guided my entire working life. So I showed up on a Monday morning in plain dark trousers, a simple button-down, and shoes that were clean but not expensive. I introduced myself to the HR coordinator as a new operations associate on temporary assignment. Nobody looked twice. That was the point. The 14th floor housed the mid-level operations team, project coordinators, data analysts, compliance officers, administrative staff who handled internal reporting and vendor communications. It was not the most glamorous floor in the building, but I had specifically requested it. If something was wrong with the culture of Harrison Global, it would show up on the 14th floor before it showed up anywhere else. My direct supervisor was Vanessa Brooks, somewhere in her mid-40s, efficient in the way people become when they've held a position long enough to know exactly how little effort is required to maintain it. She wore authority like a tailored jacket, fitted deliberate and slightly too tight for anyone else to borrow. On my first day, she looked me over once and said without particular interest that I'd be handling data consolidation for the quarterly compliance report. She handed me a stack of documents, already 3 days overdue, and walked away before I could respond. I sat down and got to work. The data was a mess: inconsistent formatting, missing source tags, duplicated entries across departments. Not difficult to fix, just tedious and time-consuming. I noticed early on that the team functioned in a particular social geography. There was an inner circle, Vanessa at the center, flanked closely by Derek Walsh and Paula Simmons, and then there was everyone else. The distinction was not subtle. Derek was loud, loose with opinions, and had a talent for saying things that sounded like jokes but weren't. Paula was quieter, the kind of person who watched everything and said only what was necessary to stay aligned with whoever held the most influence in the room. By the end of my first week, I had completed 3 assignments, originally divided among 4 people. I didn't announce this. I simply put the finished reports in the shared drive with clean formatting and moved on. 2 days later, I overheard Derek telling Vanessa that the consolidated vendor report, the one I had spent 12 hours restructuring, had been praised by the compliance director. Derek took credit for it without hesitation, without even a flicker of discomfort. Vanessa nodded approvingly and CC'd Derek on the follow-up email to senior leadership. My name did not appear anywhere in the chain. I read the email, closed my laptop, and went to get a cup of coffee. I was not surprised. I was paying attention. Over the following 2 weeks, a pattern established itself with very little variation. Any work I completed that produced a good result would be claimed by someone else, usually Derek or Paula, sometimes Vanessa herself. Any process that went wrong would find its way to my desk as my fault, regardless of whether I had been involved. There were moments that were harder to absorbed than others. One afternoon, a compliance analyst named Ruth, a woman in her early 30s who had been at the company for 6 years, made a formatting error in a regulatory submission. The error was minor and easily corrected, but Vanessa called it out in the middle of the open floor, in front of the entire team, her voice carrying enough edge to make sure everyone heard. Ruth sat very still, her face controlled. Yes, I'll correct it immediately. After Vanessa walked away, Ruth stared at her screen for a long moment without moving. I watched that moment and filed it away alongside everything else I had been collecting. What struck me was not the correction itself, but the way Ruth absorbed it, the practiced stillness of someone who had learned that any visible reaction would be used against her. There was also a quieter kind of cruelty that ran beneath the surface. Lunch plans made just loudly enough for me to hear, then finalized in a way that made clear I was not included. Questions in meetings designed not to gather information but to expose gaps. Requests arriving at 4:50 p.m. for deliverables due by morning, never with enough context to complete them cleanly, always with enough ambiguity to assign blame if something went wrong. None of it rose to the level of a formal complaint on its own. That was the sophistication of it. Each incident could be explained away individually. Together they formed something much more deliberate. I ran 5 miles most mornings before the sun came up. On those runs I processed what I was seeing, without the noise of the office around me. What I was finding on the 14th floor was not the ordinary friction of corporate life. It was a managed ecosystem. The bullying was not casual or disorganized. It was institutional, with a structure, a hierarchy, and a shared understanding among its participants about what was permitted and what was protected. People lower in the hierarchy either participated or stayed silent, because silence was the only form of neutrality the environment allowed. A company could have excellent products, strong financials, and a well-regarded brand while rotting in the middle, floor by floor, team by team, one silenced employee at a time. My father had said more than once that a company's real value was in whether the people inside it trusted each other. I was only now seeing what it looked like when the opposite was true. In my 3rd week, Vanessa assigned me to lead the documentation for a sensitive internal data audit. I built the tracking system from scratch, coordinated with 3 separate departments, and had the initial framework ready 2 days ahead of schedule. I shared access with Vanessa and Derek so the broader team could continue building on it while I completed the final sections. It was a reasonable and professional decision. I would come to understand later exactly how it was used against me. On a Thursday morning, I arrived to find Derek and Paul already in Vanessa's glass-walled office, blinds drawn, which was unusual. The HR director, Sandra Pruitt, was seated across from Vanessa with a folder open in front of her. I had barely set down my bag when Sandra stepped out and asked me to come in. Her expression was the practiced neutrality of someone delivering information they did not write. Vanessa stood to the side, arms folded. Derek sat in the corner with the specific stillness of a person who already knows how a scene ends. Sandra told me that a significant volume of restricted client data had been accessed and extracted from the audit system over the past 48 hours. The activity had originated from my access credentials. There was, she said, a clear audit trail. The company's position was that a serious breach of data security had occurred, and they could not in good conscience continue my employment. I asked to see the audit trail. Sandra looked at Vanessa. Vanessa said the documentation was being held by the legal department and was not available to me at this time. I asked if there was a process for contesting the decision. Sandra said that given the nature of the incident, the termination was immediate and final. She slid a single-page document across the desk and asked me to sign it, acknowledging receipt of the termination notice. I looked at the document for a moment, then I signed it, asked for a copy, and thanked her. I did not raise my voice. I did not look at Vanessa or Derek. I picked up my bag, walked back to my desk, and placed my coffee mug, my charger, and the one folder I kept there into the small cardboard box Sandra had left beside my chair. The floor was very quiet. People were watching without appearing to watch. I carried the box to the elevator, rode it down to the lobby, and walked out through the front entrance into the afternoon light. I stood at the top of the entrance stairs, set the box on the concrete railing, reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, scrolled to a contact saved under a single initial, and pressed call. The line connected on the second ring. 3 sentences. The first, contact the general counsel and convene the board within the hour. The second, place the full digital record of the 14th floor, every email, every access log, every performance review for the past 4 years under immediate legal hold. The third was the one that would echo through every corridor of that building before the day was over. Fire every one of them. I ended the call, picked up my box, and walked toward the parking structure. The general counsel, Martin Cole, had picked up before the second ring, which told me my father had already been in contact. I sat in my car in the parking structure with the engine off and the cardboard box on the passenger seat. I was not angry. That surprised some people when they heard the story later, but anger requires surprise, and I had not been surprised by anything that happened on the 14th floor. I had been watching it build for 3 weeks. What I felt sitting in that car was something closer to clarity, the kind that arrives when a problem you have been studying finally reveals its full shape. I drove home, changed my shirt, and was back in the building 40 minutes later. This time I did not enter through the front lobby. I took the executive elevator from the private parking level, used the access code my father had given me on my first day back in the country, and rode it directly to the 32nd floor. My father was already in the boardroom when I arrived, standing at the head of the long table because Harrison Carter did not sit in meetings when he was agitated. He looked at me when I walked in, and something in the set of his expression shifted, not quite relief, but something adjacent to it. Martin Cole was there with 2 members of the legal team. 2 board members had dialed in remotely. Sandra Pruitt sat at the far end of the table with the careful composure of someone who understood that her position in this room had changed significantly since that morning. The IT security team had already been pulled in to run a parallel audit of the data access logs. Within the first 30 minutes of examination, the trail was clear. The data extraction flagged as mine had been initiated through my credentials, but the originating device did not match any machine I had ever logged in from. The IP address resolved to a workstation registered to Derek Walsh. Someone had obtained my credentials and used them from Derek's terminal. It was not a sophisticated operation. It was the kind of thing that worked because the people doing it had never been seriously examined before. Martin set the preliminary findings on the table. The framing is unambiguous. My father looked at me and asked how I wanted to proceed. I said I wanted the evidence presented at a company-wide all-hands meeting, and I wanted no announcement of my identity beforehand. The all-hands meeting was called for 4 p.m. The notice went out company-wide. All staff, all floors, mandatory attendance in the main atrium. The message was brief. The founding chairman had an announcement regarding the company's future leadership, nothing more. On the 14th floor, Vanessa held court near the window bank, speaking in the low, confident register of someone who considered themselves adjacent to important information. She mentioned twice that transitions like this were usually opportunities for people who had demonstrated real value to the organization. Derek laughed at something she said. Paula refreshed her email. None of them connected the meeting to the termination they had executed that morning. By 3:50 the atrium was full. I stood in a side corridor watching the crowd through a narrow gap in the partition. I could see Vanessa near the center of the room, positioned with the easy confidence of someone who expected to hear good news. My father walked onto the platform at 4 o'clock. The room settled immediately. He thanked the company for its work. He said that handing Harrison Global to the right person was the most important decision he had left to make. He said the next chairman had been inside this building for the past 3 weeks and asked his daughter to come forward. I walked onto the platform. I wore the same clothes I had been fired in that morning: plain dark trousers, simple button down, clean but unremarkable shoes. The silence that came over that atrium was total. From the distance of the platform, Vanessa's face went through several changes in rapid succession: recognition first, then calculation, then something that had no clean name. I did not deliver a speech. I introduced myself, my background briefly, my father's intention, the fact that I had requested to begin as an ordinary employee. I said that decision had been the most instructive 3 weeks of my professional life. I said I had learned a great deal about the company and that some of what I had learned required immediate attention. Then I thanked my father, stepped to the side, and asked Martin Cole to take the floor. Martin was precise and unhurried. He explained that in connection with a personnel matter that had occurred earlier that day. The legal department had initiated a review of records from the 14th floor operations team. He said the review had uncovered evidence of a fabricated data breach used to terminate an employee without cause, and that further examination was already revealing a broader pattern of conduct the company took very seriously. All relevant personnel had been placed on administrative suspension effective immediately. The atrium did not erupt, it went very still, the way spaces do when the thing being said is significant enough to had people stop performing their reactions and simply absorb it. The full audit covered for years of records. In that time, the group operating under Vanessa Brooks had suppressed the advancement of at least 11 employees through manipulated evaluation scores. 3 had filed informal complaints. All 3 had been routed back to Vanessa's level, where they were documented as resolved without meaningful investigation. 1 employee had left the company after a sudden negative review appearing in their file within 2 weeks of raising a concern. Another had been quietly transferred. A third had accepted a confidential settlement. Derek Walsh's name appeared in more than 30 instances of favorable project attribution bearing no relationship to his documented contributions. Paula Simmons had served as the administrative mechanism managing internal paperwork in ways that made the misattribution difficult to trace. Vanessa sat above all of it, approving, authorizing, occasionally directing. Her fingerprints were not always on the surface, but they were in the structure. I closed the folder and looked at the window for a moment. Then I told Martin what I wanted. Terminations would cover Vanessa Brooks, Derek Walsh, Paula Simmons, and for additional team members whose participation was documented. The language of each termination notice would be specific, not a generic separation, but documentation identifying the precise conduct that led to each decision. The 2 former employees who had filed complaints and left would be contacted directly by the legal team within the week. The company would make them whole. The employee who had accepted a settlement would be contacted as well. That process should be handled with care, I said, not speed. The goal is to make it right, not to close it quickly. The following morning I rode the elevator down to the 14th floor for the first time since my termination. I walked to the center of the floor and asked everyone to gather. I didn't stand behind anything, no podium, no desk. I stood in the open space and spoke at a normal volume, which was enough for everyone to hear. I told them the audit was complete, the termination decisions were final, and I was not there to explain myself or seek their approval. I was there because the people in this room had worked in a particular environment for years, and some of them had been harmed by it. And they deserved to hear from me directly rather than through a company memo. I told them the evaluation system on this floor was being suspended immediately. Every performance record from the past 4 years would be reviewed by an independent HR team before any of it was used for any purpose going forward. A formal reporting channel would be open within the week, going directly to the legal department and to me. I asked if anyone had questions. Ruth raised her hand. She asked whether the review of performance records would affect decisions that had already been made, promotions denied, roles people had been passed over for. Yes, I said that's specifically what the review is designed to correct. Ruth nodded and lowered her hand. Something in her expression changed, not dramatically, just a slight release of something that had been held carefully in place for a long time. A project coordinator near the back raised his hand and asked whether people who had stayed silent would be penalized. I answered directly. The review was focused on documented participation, not on silence. I understood that staying silent in that environment had not been a neutral choice, it had been a survival choice. And I was not interested in punishing people for calculating what it would cost them to speak when the system gave them no safe way to do so. What I was interested in was making sure that calculation never had to happen again. Several people around him visibly exhaled. That afternoon, Vanessa called the main legal line and asked to speak with me directly. The call lasted 11 minutes. She did not begin with an apology, she began with context. The pressure she had been under, the expectations from above, the competitive nature of the environment she had inherited. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, I said that I had read the full audit, including records that predated the most recent incidents, and that the pattern it documented was not a product of external pressure. It was a choice, sustained over 4 years, that had damaged real people's careers and in some cases their livelihoods. The decision would not change. Vanessa said she had given the company 8 years. I said I understood, and that the severance terms were consistent with her contract and the company's obligations. I thanked her for the call and ended it. My father came to the office on Friday afternoon. He did not come for any scheduled purpose. He came, I understood, simply to be present. We walked the building together for about an hour, moving floor by floor. At the end we stood near the window on the 32nd floor looking out at the city in the late afternoon light. He said he had spent for decades building something and had been afraid in the last few years that it had begun to come apart in ways he could not fully see from where he sat. I said I understood that now. He said he did not doubt that I would handle it correctly. I said I wasn't certain of that, but I intended to stay close to the floor to keep looking at what was actually happening, not just at what the reports said was happening. He nodded slowly. That was always the right instinct, he said. I simply stopped trusting it in myself when the company grew large enough that looking down became uncomfortable. The cardboard box I had carried out through the front entrance 2 weeks earlier was still in the back seat of my car. One evening, after the building had emptied and the only light left on the 32nd floor was the one above my desk, I went down to the parking level and brought it up. I set it on the corner of my desk and opened it. The coffee mug I put on the windowsill, the phone charger I plugged in, the folder I filed in the cabinet beside the desk. They were not significant objects, but they were the things I had carried out of a situation designed to make me feel like I did not belong there. There was something worth keeping in having them visible. A leader is not remembered for the moment they reveal their power. They are remembered for what they choose to do with it, who they protect, who they make whole, and what kind of place they leave behind for the people who will still be there long after the names on the termination notices have faded from memory. I understood that now in a way I had not fully understood before I walked through that front entrance in plain clothes and asked for a desk on the 14th floor. The work had just begun, but it had begun honestly. And that was the only foundation that had ever held anything of real value together.